Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Business Talk. This is the second series in the spring semester of 2022. And today we have two speakers, Professor David Hagmann from our Department of Management and Professor Ralph van der Lans from our Department of Marketing. Today's focus is about what affects people's attention. So as usual, we have scheduled two talks. David will start by talking about how we could actually nudge out the carbon tax. I think the topic itself, the domain, is a very timely one where globally everybody is now looking into how we can reduce carbon emission, and carbon tax is actually one common instrument that was proposed by the regulators. And then after that, Ralph is going to share his latest work with us related to how we can actually seed social media properly so that we can get more attention in online social networks. I believe this is a very important and timely topic that a lot of marketers are interested in. So before I let the speakers start their talk, as usual, we would like to impose some house rule. When you join these seminars, please mute your microphone as much as you can before you speak. And in case if you have any question, you can raise your hand, unmute yourself, and then you can speak out. Or you can type your question in the chat room as well, and I will try to moderate and ask the speakers for your question as well. Okay, as usual, each speaker will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and we'll leave a couple of minutes for Q&A. And we will go, we'll take turn, right? David will go first, and then Ralph will be second, and then after that, we'll have an overall Q&A as well. Okay, without further ado, David, it will be your time now. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kai-Lung, for organizing this and for having me, and thank you also, Ricky. So yeah, as Kai-Lung mentioned, today I'm going to talk about policy problems, and I'm going to talk specifically about climate change, but I think it's a concept that is going to apply to a wide range of topics. And I think it's not something that only applies to policy and government responses to policy problems, but actually also to organizations and behavior in organizations. So maybe at the risk of stating the obvious, there are many problems that we're facing in the world, right? If you think about organizations, discrimination in hiring, for example, is one of the big timely topics, and one that can have very large economic consequences. If you're in finance, one thing you might really worry about is, how can we help people save more for retirement, right? How can we make sure they spend less today so that when they retire, they actually have some savings? And then, if you read the news at all, right, climate change is a pressing problem, and it's one where we're sort of running out of time in terms of responding, right? We actually need to act soon. And so this is, I think, just one of the, if not the most high stakes problem we have. And so that is the focus of our research and of today's talk. But as I mentioned, I think the concepts are going to apply to other domains as well. So first, what makes climate change kind of an interesting problem to think about from a policy response is that we actually understand the problem pretty well. The first report by the IPCC is now more than 30 years old, right? And we kind of know what the reason for climate change and global warming is. It's greenhouse gas emissions as a result of human activity. And so the kind of obvious thing we need to do is we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, right? Seems obvious, seems easy. But of course, the big problem is that reducing emissions is really costly. Some estimates put the cost at around $50 trillion US, which is roughly half of the global GDP. So that's expensive, right? Now, if you talk to economists, one obvious solution that will come up is like, let's put a price on carbon, right? Let's actually disincentivize polluting, either with a carbon tax or almost equivalently a cap and trade system. And so what happens then is if you cause pollutions, if you cause any kind of greenhouse gas emission, you actually have to pay for it. And that solves the externality problem. So that's kind of how economists tend to think about this. But the big problem with this, and why we generally do not have this, right, is that nobody actually wants to pay. This is really costly. People who are polluting don't want to pay for the pollution. So there's a lot of resistance to it. And we don't really seem to be making progress on any kind of global agreement, and even at the national level. This is super hard to do. So what can we do in the meantime? Well, there's a book that came out now quite a while ago. It's titled Nudge, and it's by Dick Taylor and Cass Sunstein. So Taylor has since received the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work in exactly this area. And what is a nudge, right? What is the idea of a nudge? It's like, well, maybe we can use insights from psychology to change people's behavior, right? But maybe we can kind of make some subtle changes to the environment that people are in, and then we can get them to do all kinds of things, save more for retirement, pollute less, all these wonderful things that we can't pass hard policies for. Maybe we can actually nudge people a little bit. And this is really promising because it avoids the need for both taxes and mandates, right? It's much less likely to face political opposition when you're talking about a sort of a subtle change rather than a big systemic reform. And so this, perhaps not surprisingly, then has become super popular. So this is just one map of organizations around the world using these insights for public policy. And you can't read any of the names because there's over 200 of them, right? Over 200 organizations, both within governments and within international organizations, have emerged to implement these ideas and try and influence behavior in ways that doesn't rely on mandates and taxes. So what does this actually look like in practice? And this is one of the most successful interventions overall, and particularly as it relates to climate change and reducing carbon emissions. So what happens here, right? This is a utility bill from a company called O-Power. And what it does is it highlights your comparison to other electricity uses, right? You're using a lot of energy here. The average neighbor is using a lot less, and the efficient neighbor even less than that. Right, this could be you should use less energy. It's also telling you something about the cost. How expensive is it actually for you to use this energy? About $180, right, in 6 months. And then you get some information about what it is you could be doing. Now, this is great, right? We have to send people utility bills. Let's put some thought into it. Let's not just put a number on it. Let's actually give some information. And this has been rolled out in countries around the world. This is a super popular intervention. And so now you can figure out like what kind of impact does it have, right? Does it actually work? Fortunately, it does reduce carbon emissions, but by how much? Well, by about 365 kilowatt hours per year per household. Now, if you're like me, you have no idea whether that's a lot or a little. How do we put this into context? We can convert it to carbon emissions. So it's about 0.3 tons. Doesn't sound like all that much, but how much is it? Well, we can think about it in terms of an economic impact. We can put a dollar amount on it, right? And so at the prevailing market price of carbon offsets, the impact is $2 per household per year, as one of the most successful interventions in this nudge domain, right? It's not so great. Now you can think about the social cost of carbon, which is higher, but then you're at $12, which is still not that great. But now you might say, hold on, we have to send people a utility bill anyway, right? Like we're going to send them a bill anyway. Why not do a better one? Why not, right? That there's no cost to doing it. Once you redesign it, you just ship it out, same cost. Might as well. But what if there is a cost, right? What if there's a cost that is not quite so apparent? So this idea of nudges has always been an idea of complements, right? This is not going to be a replacement for a carbon tax or some other kind of standard policy. This is an addition, right? We can do more, we can do some small gains, but it costs us nothing, so let's do it. But that's not how the public might think of this, right? They might not see this as an addition. They might see, oh, we can get people to use less energy with this subtle change. Let's just do that. And then you have to kind of deal with potential motivated reasoning, right? It's really tempting to pass something that costs you effectively nothing and avoids you from having to pay a true cost, right? It's kind of a tempting alternative if you treat it as such. And so that's what my colleagues and I were trying to set out to figure out, right? Is there a potential risk here that these kind of interventions, these nudges, actually end up reducing support for things like carbon taxes? Because people don't treat them as complements, that they actually perceive them as substitutes. So here's sort of the main idea of the study, and we've done a couple versions of this. But the main idea is we serve about 200 people across the US, and we try and get their support for implementing either a carbon tax or a nudge, right? So the carbon tax we set at $40 per ton, which is the high end of this estimate, right? It's kind of the social cost. That's roughly where a policy should be if we did this for real. And then we actually used a slightly different nudge. We used one that was defaulting people into renewable energy plans. So that's another one that's commonly proposed, and it's actually one that's kind of easy to explain to people, right? Instead of getting this gray, dirty energy that you usually get, you can just pay a little bit of extra money and then you get renewable energy. And let's just put in people by default into this plan, right? Turns out it's actually even less effective than the other intervention. But we thought let's give people something that's easy to explain. So then in one treatment, right, they learn about these policies, and then in one of our treatments, all they can do is decide whether to implement the carbon tax or nothing. So those are the only two options for them. In the other condition, they actually have a lot more options. So they can either choose to implement only the carbon tax, but not the nudge, only the nudge and not the carbon tax, or they can do both of these policies, right? If they say, let's just do all, they will just say yes to both. And we're actually interested in the implementation of the tax, so we just combine A and C, right? As long as you say yes to the tax, we consider that a win. If you only say yes to the nudge as a result, that's problematic. So if you just ask people about the tax, you actually get pretty high support. You get about 70% of people who said they would be willing to implement this. They would be supportive of doing that. When you add the nudge to it, support drops by about 15 points, right? It goes down to 55. Now you're basically at tie. And so the idea here is that introducing this nudge and giving it as an option actually does diminish support for the tax. So that's a problem, right? Now, the first thing you might think is like, how robust is this finding? So maybe people just don't want to do two things. So just giving them two things, they say like, oh, I only want to do one of them. And if it's going to be one, it's going to be at least a nudge, right? Not the tax. And so we got 600 new people and we had 3 conditions. In the first one, same kind of as before, right now you only learn about the tax. Do you want to implement it, yes or no? Another condition, you only learn about the nudge, there's no tax. I'm sorry, you make a decision only about the nudge at first, right? You haven't heard about the tax. Do you want it, yes or no? And then, hey, there's a new issue, right? We can't do this nudge, but here's the carbon tax. Would you like to do that? Yes or no? And then the third one replicates the old version, which is you learn about both policies, and then you make a decision about both. So this is not an artifact of the way we asked, it replicates completely, right? So you can ask people separately, you just change the order in which you ask them. Even so, you see the same kind of crowding out. Now you might ask, is this unique to climate change, right? I said this is a very big problem, but we're not just trying to talk about climate change, we're trying to talk about policy solutions more generally. So we wanted to see if we can actually also get the same problem to occur in a different domain, specifically in the domain of retirement savings. So instead of asking people about implementing a carbon tax, what we're going to ask them about is whether they would like to increase in the US the Social Security tax and the benefits that come with it. So this is sort of a forced saving for retirement, right? You don't have a choice about this, but then you get more money when you retire. And then the nudge is one that's commonly proposed in finance and actually has also been rolled out across the US, which is defaulting people into a retirement savings plan. So instead of having to check a box to say you want to contribute extra funds to your retirement, it's actually happening by default, and you have to check a box if you don't want to do it. And this is actually, again, one of a pretty successful nudges. It does actually change some behavior, but it doesn't really seem to get people to actually save more. It has some other downstream problems. Okay, so we got 600 people, and again, same question as before, right? And does this nudge crowd out support for the stronger policy with a bigger impact? And we replicate the findings nearly exactly, right? A lot of support, at least a majority support for increasing Social Security if they only know about this tax at first. But then once they first learn about the nudge, support for the expansion of Social Security for this increase in the Social Security tax declines. And again, it doesn't matter if we just change the order and we ask them once at a time, or if we give them both policies at the same time. So that's a problem. But of course, the question you might have is this just something that lay people do, right? So we've been surveying people in the United States. These are not people who are involved in actually making policy, right? Now, policymakers do tend to be responsive to opinion polls, but of course, they might just be much more sophisticated, right? And so maybe if you actually know something about crafting policy, you realize this is going to be a very small effect. you're not going to have your support crowded out in the same fashion. You're more sophisticated, right? So one of my co-authors and at the time were based at Carnegie Mellon, and we walked over to the public policy program and we asked them if we could get the email address of all the alumni of the school. And surprisingly, they said yes. So we emailed about 3,500 alumni, and we got over 600 responses. And so about 90%, almost 9 in 10 had a master's degree, and the remainder had a PhD, right? There are no undergraduate degrees from that school. About half of them actually said they have either past or current employment in policy. So these are people who are actively involved, right, in doing some implementing or writing about policy and advocating for it. And perhaps to the dismay of my co-author, 40% of people actually took a graduate level behavioral economics class. So they all learned about these nudges and interventions. And perhaps most of them, I think, actually may have taken his class. So, this is like, does he, as the person also doing this, right, have some effect debiasing them? So then we asked them, as before, right, about support for standard policy or nudge. We only changed the order in which we asked the questions this time, so only 2 conditions. But then we also had them do this either about the environment, that is the carbon tax and the default, or the retirement domain, the social security tax expansion, or defaulting into retirement savings, right? So we want to see, does this apply to both domains? Unfortunately, yes, it does, right? Policymakers fall victim to this effect just as much as lay people do. And in fact, if you look at the data only by people who say that they're actively working in policy, the effect size is even bigger. So to some extent, they're actually more vulnerable than the policy people or than the graduates in general. So that raises a big problem. Can we actually fix this problem? Because yeah, these nudges have small effects, but they have non-zero effects, right? They do at least something and they cost almost nothing. So it'd be really helpful if we could still use them without losing support for other policies. And so one way we might go about this, right, is we can actually just outright tell people, look, this nudge is not going to have a big effect, right? Don't expect too much from it. We can also try and make the carbon tax less painful, right? So to disentangle this motivated reasoning and say, look, yeah, there's going to be a carbon tax if you implement this, but there's actually going to be a reduction in other taxes. So your total tax burden doesn't necessarily go up. So we got about 800 people, 750 of them, and we asked them in 4 conditions about support. For one, either just the tax at first, then they learn about the nudge, and they decide if they want to support that. We flip the order, right? First about the nudge, then about the tax. And then we have this new condition where first you learn about this nudge. And as you learn about it, you're also told that it's going to have a pretty small effect, right? Small effect size. Don't expect too much. And now here's a tax, right? Do you want to implement that one? And again, the 4th one, you first learn about the nudge, and then you learn about the tax, along with information that this could be used to offset other taxes. And so the idea we kind of have here is, right, like perhaps the 3rd and the 4th condition are going to solve this crowding out problem. Maybe in those cases, we're actually going to see support for the tax again. So what does it look like? So if we just ask about the tax, again, about 70% of people are in favor of doing this. If we ask about the nudge, we replicate our effect, crowding out happens. Okay, now what about the new thing, right? What if we tell people this nudge is not actually going to have much of an effect? Support for the carbon tax jumps back up. What if we make the tax seem less painful, make it more attractive? Same here, right? We do not get this crowding out if people think it's not actually a substitute, and we don't get crowding out if people don't actually think the carbon tax is going to be all that painful. Now, one thing you might wonder is, like, what does this do in support for the nudge, right? If I just tell you this nudge is actually not very effective, turns out it doesn't do anything to decrease support for that nudge. So people are totally okay passing a policy where they don't think it's going to have a big effect, as long as they know it's cheap, right? And that's exactly what they should be doing. That's the right way to think about this. It's very cheap, but it doesn't have a big effect. Let's do it, but let's not use it as a substitute for other things. So the key finding of this, right, is that people seem to appear in some way to overestimate the effectiveness of this nudge. They maybe think this is costless, this is going to solve the problem, and so they treat it as a substitute rather than a complement. And this could, of course, be the result of motivated reasoning if you don't want to pay a tax, right? You don't want to get taxed on something. And as a result, they actually become less supportive of this higher impact policy. So on its own, this can actually be a real cost that we haven't really kept in mind so far. And then as long as we can highlight that this nudge is not actually a solution, or that the tax isn't as painful as people think, we can solve this problem and restore support for the tax. Okay, but this is kind of the application in the policy domain, right? This is thinking about nudges and climate change and retirement savings. But I think we need to think about effect sizes more generally, right? So this is a quote from Christine Lagarde. At the time, she was the head of the IMF. Now she's the head of the European Central Bank. And she's talking about risk-seeking differences between men and women. So it's generally, I think, widely known and believed that men take more risks than women. And so commenting on the financial crisis, she said, as I've said many times, if it had been Lehman Sisters rather than Lehman Brothers, the world might well look a lot different today, right? We would have less risk-seeking people in charge of financial institutions, then maybe, it's less likely that there's a financial crisis. So there's this suggestion, right? There's this evidence that men take more risks than women, but what does the evidence look like, right? So one example, which is actually pretty representative of how these studies work, is a stylized investment game, where students in finance get about 25 euros to invest, and there's some risk and some return, right? And if you're trying to figure out how risk-seeking people are, you look at how much of this 25 euros do they actually invest. So men on average invest just over 16 euros, and women invest on average just under 15 euros. So this is a statistically significant difference, but it's not a major difference, right? I mean, you would not want to shape financial policy on a difference of €1.40 in a stylized investment game. And so I think that's something we actually see very often, right? This idea that there are very big claims made about effects that are ultimately pretty small. When you start looking for this, you see it everywhere, right? You see a lot of discussion of, oh, this works. But you don't hear much about how much it works, right? How big is the actual effect when you look at it? So if you think about one of the examples I had at the beginning, right, is discrimination in hiring, sort of as a problem that organizations face. And it's really important because you want to do something about this because attracting and retaining key talent is just so important. Now, if you look at what companies do, they tend to spend money on diversity training. So in the US, it was about $9 billion in 2019. And now you might think that's a lot of money, or you might think that's not a lot of money at all, right, given the size of the economy. But either way, it turns out that there's no impact on behavior, right? There's no evidence that any of this money actually helps reduce discrimination in hiring. And that's a big problem because it's a huge thing we need to solve, right? We need to do something about it, but the things we're doing don't seem to have much of an effect size. And so the takeaway message I'd hope you have here is that small changes rarely have big effects, even if we really, really wish that they did and could solve these problems. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, David. Very interesting findings and ideas. I think we have a few minutes. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, I think I see something in the chat room. Could you share more details of the materials you have used in the nudge treatment? What would be the psychological explanations of this treatment?
That's a great question. I'm happy to send you all the raw materials of the study. They're actually also online if you search for the title of the paper. But effectively, we don't explain to them why the nudge would work. We present it as something that has been proposed. In terms of how it actually works in practice is that it's a lot of social comparison. So when you find out that you pollute more than other people, that's an incentive, or that seems to change behavior so that people actually pollute less.
Good. I also have a related question. So you are looking at people's attitude towards the carbon tax after they have seen it, and then you follow by a nudge, or you show them a nudge first. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, when you say you add a treatment that the nudge has a small effect, that undoes the damage that it does on the carbon tax. But would it then induce people to actually basically disregard the nudge that supposedly the nudge was nudging them to save electricity, right? But adding that treatment, would that actually nullify the effect of the nudge itself?
That's a good question. So in terms of support for the nudge, it doesn't have an impact. So they're equally supportive of doing the nudge. One question could be if they actually know they're being nudged, right? Does that mean the nudge stops working, right? If we tell everyone, here's an intervention, it's based on psychology, does it lose its effect? And actually, one of my co-authors here now, we have a separate paper where we show that this doesn't seem to happen. So even when people are aware that actually they are being nudged, we have a decision where they're being nudged on an end-of-life healthcare decision, and they know they're being nudged and it works just as well. And even if you tell them after, right, they don't regret their decision. They think this one that they've freely made.
I see. Interesting. Well, I see that Veronique has another question. Veronique, why don't you switch on the mic and ask yourself?
Okay. I'm curious about why we do these nudges if there is no effect. Like I'm thinking this $9 billion spent on diversity training with no effect whatsoever. Why do we do it? Is it because, we feel good about it?
That's an excellent question. I think there's certainly some of that, right? It feels like we're doing something. I think the cynical view would be that it's good PR. So you can always say you have done something, right? When you get criticized or when there's some bad news coverage. And in fact, often when there's some kind of scandal, companies respond by spending on these programs. But I think the less cynical version is maybe that companies think it has a chance of working and they don't know what else to do, right? Potential other solutions might be very costly, or they might require substantial investments that they don't have support for. And so they think, well, we might as well do this rather than nothing. And I think sort of speaking to our research, right, it suggests that maybe this could actually prevent other measures from then getting a foothold in the company.